A 4-year-old girl keeps pointing insistently at her mother's coffin until someone calls the police and her father is arrested. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the journey. It was a morning like no other in the quiet town of Glenview, a peaceful place nestled in the hills where everyone knew each other, and the rhythms of daily life were gentle and predictable. Yet today, something heavy hung in the air. The day began with a chill, both in the weather and in the hearts of the people who lived there. The streets were still, but a low murmur of whispers started to travel from house to house, as though the town was holding its breath. In the middle of it all, inside a small, modest home, stood a scene of unspeakable sorrow. The living room was dimly lit, with sunlight filtering through drawn curtains. In the center of the room, a wooden coffin sat on a raised platform, surrounded by a cluster of flowers that seemed out of place amidst the sorrow. The mourners had already left. There were no more tears, no more words. All except one. 4-year-old. Emma stood in front of the coffin, her tiny hand outstretched, pointing directly at the dark wooden lid. Her big brown eyes, usually filled with innocence, now held a peculiar intensity. She said nothing, only the finger, rigid and unwavering, pointing to the coffin, to her mother. Her father, Brian, stood motionless nearby, his eyes hollow, his face pale. His grief was as silent as Emma's gesture, yet something about him felt wrong. His eyes flicked nervously to his daughter's pointed finger, but he said nothing. He hadn't spoken a word since that morning. "Emma, sweetheart," Brian said, his voice cracking. "It's not real. She's not coming back." But Emma didn't flinch. Her finger remained in place, relentless. Somewhere outside, the sound of sirens approached, muffled at first, growing louder with each passing second. Brian didn't hear them, or maybe he did, but his mind was too clouded to notice. "Come on, sweetie, let's sit down," he said, his voice strained, trying to break the silence. But Emma didn't move. She simply kept pointing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until the door opened with a creak and 2 police officers entered. They had been summoned after a tip from a concerned neighbor. Emma's pointed finger had been noticed, and so had Brian's odd behavior in the days that followed. But the officers didn't speak right away. They simply stood in the doorway, watching. The room felt colder. "You need to come with us, Brian," one of the officers said quietly, his tone cold but professional. "We need to ask you some questions." Brian stiffened. He knew this moment had arrived even before the sirens. He was trapped in a world of silent accusations, and Emma was still pointing. Emma's eyes flicked briefly toward the officers, then returned to the coffin. And for the first time, she whispered, "Daddy did it." Brian's knees buckled and his face drained of what little color remained. The officers exchanged a glance. Before the scene could unfold any further, the officer who had spoken stepped forward. "We're going to have to arrest you, Brian," he said. "It's standard procedure. We'll sort it out later." Brian's mouth went dry. His mind raced and he tried to process the whirlwind of emotions: grief, fear, guilt. His baby girl had just pointed the finger at him, but it wasn't a game. It wasn't a misunderstanding. She knew. He took one last look at Emma, who was still standing there, her tiny hand outstretched. Her face was blank, but her eyes, they were filled with something dark, something no child should ever know. "Daddy did it," the words echoed. In his mind, as he allowed the officers to cuff his wrists, he couldn't even fight them. What would he say? He hadn't even come close to processing the enormity of what had happened. His wife, Emma's mother, was dead. And now his daughter had just pointed to him as the cause. The officers guided him toward the door, but he hesitated. "Emma, please," he said, his voice weak. "I didn't." But Emma wasn't listening. She was still staring at the coffin, still pointing, silent. The small house that once felt like home now seemed hollow. The air was thick with a tension so dense that it almost felt like you could touch it. The sound of Brian's heavy footsteps echoed as he was led out of the house by the officers, each step dragging him deeper into a nightmare he couldn't comprehend. Emma's words lingered in his mind like an insidious whisper. Daddy did it. How could she say that? What did she mean? There was no way. He hadn't done anything. He couldn't have. The officers led him down the front steps, their firm grip on his arms tightening as they maneuvered him to the police car parked at the curb. Brian's heart hammered in his chest, each beat louder than the last. He wanted to scream, to protest, to explain himself, but no words came. What could he say? How could he prove he hadn't done what his daughter, his own flesh and blood, seemed so certain of? The town of Glenview was small, and the residents, though kind, had a way of talking that could turn a whisper into a full-blown gossip storm. By the time Brian reached the car, he could already feel the eyes of the neighbors on him. He didn't even dare look up. It didn't matter anymore. The whispers would be there whether he faced them or not. The officer in the passenger seat glanced back at him as he was pushed into the rear of the squad car. This is just standard procedure, Brian. We're going to figure this out, but you need to understand your daughter's statement. It doesn't make sense. Statement? Brian barely recognized his own voice. It sounded hollow, far away. She's just a little girl. She doesn't know what she's saying. The officer nodded slowly, but his eyes didn't soften. People say a lot of things in moments like this, but kids often see things adults miss, especially when it comes to trauma. We'll get to the bottom of it. The car door slammed shut and the vehicle rumbled to life. As they drove away from the house, Brian's eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror. The house, the coffin. The little girl who had pointed at him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It all felt like a bad dream. And yet, it was real. Emma had said it. The words couldn't be unsaid. And now they were hanging over him like a dark cloud. The police station was busy when they arrived, but Brian didn't notice anything around him. His thoughts were a storm of confusion and dread. He was led into an interrogation room, its walls painted a dull, lifeless gray. There were no windows, just a single flickering fluorescent light above. The officer who had arrested him sat across the table, his face impassive. Brian, I need you to tell me exactly what happened, he said, his voice clipped but not unkind. Everything. Brian stared at the table, his hands trembling. I don't know what to say. I don't even know how to explain this. He lifted his eyes to meet the officer's. I didn't do anything wrong. The officer raised an eyebrow. It's not about what you did or didn't do, Brian. It's about understanding what happened. Your daughter's statement, Emma didn't mean it, she's just a little girl. She was pointing at her mother's coffin. I think she's confused. She's been through so much and Brian's voice faltered, the words sticking in his throat. She lost her mom. She's just grieving. I've been trying to comfort her, trying to make sense of it all, but I never. He trailed off, unable to finish his thought. Was there any history of issues in the household? The officer's question was neutral, but Brian could hear the weight behind it. No, Brian answered quickly. No history. No fights. We were a family. His voice cracked as he spoke the word family, as if it were a distant memory, something he could no longer claim. The officer paused before continuing. We'll need to talk to your daughter, see what she knows. Maybe she saw something that could help us understand. Brian's heart sank. He was desperate for the truth to come out, for someone to believe him. Please, she's just a child. She doesn't understand. She didn't mean it. She's too young to know what she's saying. The officer nodded, but his expression was unreadable. We'll see. For now, just try to relax. You're not under arrest yet, but don't leave town. As the officer stood up and walked out of the room, Brian was left alone, the silence in the small, windowless space pressing in on him. He closed his eyes, willing himself to think clearly, but every thought was tangled with fear and confusion. He hadn't done anything wrong, but Emma's words, the cold certainty in her tiny voice, kept echoing in his mind. Daddy did it. Brian sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, his mind spinning with a whirlwind of thoughts. He was numb, but his heart was pounding. He had tried to make sense of everything. How could she say that? How could Emma, his own daughter, the one who had always looked up to him with such trust in her eyes, point at him like that? The door creaked open, snapping him out of his thoughts. A uniformed officer entered, his face stern but not unfriendly. He was followed by another officer, holding a small notepad, looking like he was ready to record every word. "We need to talk to Emma," the first officer said, his voice flat without a hint of emotion. "She's in the other room. But you need to understand that this isn't just about her statements anymore. There's more to this, Brian." "More?" Brian's mind raced. What do they mean, more? Before he could respond, the officer was already on his way out the door. "Take a seat. I'll get the child psychologist to talk to her." Brian stood up quickly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I want to see her. Please," he pleaded, his voice breaking. The officer paused in the doorway, looking back at him with a hint of sympathy that only made Brian's stomach tighten further. "We need to be sure she's safe to talk, Brian. You know how it is with kids, they're fragile right now." Brian nodded, though inside he felt like his insides were turning to stone. They thought he had done something to his daughter. Something unforgivable. They didn't know him at all. The minutes dragged on as Brian sat in the sterile room, his hands clenching and unclenching on the table. The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. What happened to his family? How had things turned so dark so quickly? Then the door opened again. This time, it wasn't the officer, it was a woman. She looked to be in her early 40s with a calm, composed demeanor. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her eyes were sharp and focused, the way a professional's would be. She didn't say a word at first, but Brian could tell from the way she looked at him that she knew exactly what this was about. "Brian Stevens?" she asked softly. He nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, that's me. I'm Dr. Evelyn Carter. I'm the child psychologist. We're going to talk to your daughter now." Brian's chest tightened. "What's going to happen? Is she okay?" Dr. Carter's expression softened, but only slightly. "She's under a lot of stress right now, but she's safe. We'll take it slow. I can't promise that she'll say anything clear or helpful, but we'll see." Brian swallowed hard, nodding as he tried to force himself to remain calm. "Doctor," Carter stepped back, motioning for him to sit down again. "Please, wait here, I'll be back shortly." And then, just like that, she was gone. Brian didn't know how long he sat there, waiting. His thoughts raced, his heart drumming against his ribcage. What had really happened? What did Emma know? She was only 4 years old. Could she truly understand the gravity of what was going on? Could she possibly have been traumatized by something he didn't know about? Something that wasn't even on his radar? As the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, Brian's mind replayed the events leading up to the day his life was shattered. He had been at work when he received the phone call. The call no one ever expects. Emma's mother, Lisa, had passed away suddenly. An aneurysm, they'd said. One moment she was fine, and the next, she was gone. The funeral was supposed to be the hardest part. The grief, the mourning, the numbness. He had thought that he would be able to help Emma through it. He had tried to be strong for her, to reassure her, to hold her hand and tell her that everything would be okay. But now everything was slipping through his fingers. How could she point at me? What was she trying to say? The door opened again, this time more slowly. Brian's breath hitched as Dr. Carter stepped inside, her expression unreadable. "Brian, we need to talk." He stood up quickly, his heart pounding in his throat. "What happened? What did she say?" Dr. Carter motioned for him to sit again, and he obeyed without question. She sat across from him, her eyes focused. "Emma is very confused right now, but she said something that we need to look into." Her voice was calm, but Brian could hear the gravity in it. "What did she say?" Brian asked, his hands trembling. "Doctor..." Carter took a deep breath, then leaned forward slightly. Emma told us she saw someone else in the room with her mother before she passed. She said, "Daddy did it." Her eyes held his as if waiting for some sort of reaction. Brian's heart skipped a beat. "What? No, that's impossible." His voice cracked and he was sure it sounded desperate. "She didn't mean it. She's just a kid. She doesn't understand." Dr. Carter held up her hand to stop him. "I'm not saying anything about your guilt or innocence, Brian, but it's clear that Emma is associating your presence with something. We're just trying to figure out what happened." Brian's mind was in turmoil, but he forced himself to listen. He had to. He couldn't let his emotions take control, not yet. "She's just repeating things she doesn't understand," he said, his voice shaking with disbelief. "She's grieving. She saw something maybe. Maybe she saw me upset. Maybe she's confusing things." Dr. Carter nodded, though her gaze never left him. "That could be. But we need to understand the full picture. If Emma is seeing something, or remembering something, we can't ignore it." Brian's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of the conversation. What did she mean? What had happened to Lisa? What did Emma really see? Is she still okay? He asked, his voice breaking slightly. "She's not in trouble, right? No one is saying your daughter is in trouble, Brian. We're trying to help her. But you need to understand that everything she says will be examined. And right now there are a lot of questions." Brian's stomach churned. He wasn't sure what was worse, what Emma had said, or the fact that they were now looking at him as the suspect. "But I didn't do it," he thought. "I didn't hurt Lisa. I loved her. I loved her." But the seed of doubt had been planted, and the question now wasn't whether or not he loved Lisa. It was whether or not he was capable of something far worse. He sat there, numb, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. The walls of the interrogation room felt like they were closing in. What was the truth? The night had fallen when Brian was escorted to a new room, one far less sterile than the interrogation room he had been sitting in for what felt like hours. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and he could hear muffled voices outside, but none of it registered. His mind was elsewhere, consumed by the conversation he'd just had with Dr. Carter. He still couldn't comprehend what Emma had said. "Daddy did it." That phrase echoed in his mind like an unrelenting drumbeat. But what did she mean? Did she mean that he hurt Lisa? That was impossible. He hadn't. But why would his little girl say such a thing? Dr. Carter's calm, professional demeanor haunted him. "We need to understand the full picture." The full picture. The phrase weighed heavily in the air, and the more Brian thought about it, the more it gnawed at him. What had happened before Lisa passed? What had Emma seen? The door opened suddenly, breaking his thoughts. "Brian," came a voice from the doorway. He looked up to see Officer Harris. The officer had been the one who first took him into custody, earlier that evening. He had a stern face, but there was something else behind his eyes, something that Brian couldn't quite place. Brian stood up. "What now? Is Emma okay? Why am I still here?" His voice cracked, desperation leaking through. His mind was racing. He couldn't stay here much longer. He needed answers. He needed to go home. Harris nodded, then closed the door behind him, walking toward Brian. "I'm sorry about all of this. I know it's been a lot to process, but we need to keep you here for a little while longer. We're still piecing everything together." "What do you mean? What else is there to piece together?" "Emma is just confused. She's a 4-year-old. Why are you treating me like this?" Brian's voice had escalated, the frustration and fear mixing into a potent cocktail that left him lightheaded. Harris didn't answer immediately. Instead, he just stared at Brian, his face hardening. "There's more to your wife's death than we originally thought, and you need to understand something, Brian. We have to treat this seriously." "More," Brian repeated, his pulse quickening. "You're telling me there's something more than what happened to Lisa?" The officer nodded slowly. "We've got a few details that don't add up. There are some things we need to investigate before we move forward." Brian felt his breath catch in his chest. "What things? Tell me. Please. I need to understand." My daughter thinks I did something, but I didn't. I swear I didn't. Harris stepped closer. That's why we're keeping you here, Brian. The situation is more complicated than you think. You're not in any immediate danger, but I have to tell you something. His voice lowered and the weight of his words hung in the air. We found something at your house, something that could change everything. Brian's heart skipped a beat. What did you find? What are you talking about? Before Harris could respond, the door swung open again. A new officer stepped in, one that Brian didn't recognize. She looked at Harris, then turned to Brian. We're going to need you to come with us, Mr. Stevens, the officer said. Her voice clipped. Where? Brian asked, his voice trembling with both fear and exhaustion. Harris held up his hand to silence him. We're taking you to your house. We need you to come with us now. Brian stood, the room spinning for a moment as his head tried to process what was happening. His mind raced. What could they possibly have found in the house? What could be so important? The officers led him out of the interrogation room, and as they moved through the cold, quiet hallways, Brian couldn't help but wonder if his life was about to shatter further. What had he missed? What was everyone else seeing that he couldn't? Was there really something sinister hiding behind Emma's words? The drive to his house was tense. The only sounds were the quiet hum of the police car and the occasional creak of the tires over the wet pavement. Brian sat in the back seat, trying not to let his thoughts run wild. But it was impossible. Everything was slipping away from him. He had tried so hard to keep it together, for Emma's sake. After Lisa died, he had done everything he could think of to be strong for his daughter. They'd spent hours together, just the two of them, trying to hold on to something, anything, that would make this all feel real again. But now it seemed like his entire world was unraveling. His daughter, the one person he would do anything for, was now the one person who was pointing the finger at him. The car finally came to a stop in front of his house. The lights from the police vehicles illuminated the driveway, casting long shadows on the walls. Brian was told to stay in the car while the officers entered first. He obeyed, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. Moments later, the officers returned. They didn't speak to him right away. Harris opened the door, his face pale, and motioned for Brian to follow him. When Brian stepped inside his house, the familiar smell of his living room made his chest tighten. It felt like everything here had been turned upside down. Where's Emma? He asked, his voice strained. She's at her aunt's house, Officer Harris replied, his tone colder now. We didn't want her here while we searched, but we've got some new information that we need to address. Brian was led to the kitchen. It was where it all started, the place where they had eaten their last meal together, where Lisa had collapsed without warning. The same kitchen, but it felt like a different world now. One of the officers had a small bag with him, and when he opened it, Brian's heart stopped. Inside were a few pieces of clothing. His mind screamed, "What is this?" "That's what we found," Harris said, his voice hardening. "These clothes weren't just left here by accident, and they're not Lisa's. They don't belong to anyone in your family." Brian blinked, trying to make sense of it. "What? What do you mean they don't belong to anyone in my family? Whose are they?" Harris didn't answer right away. He just looked at Brian with a strange, calculating gaze, and Brian knew something wasn't right. Suddenly, the room felt suffocating. Everything was pressing in on him. Who else had been in this house? The air in the house felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in around Brian. He couldn't take his eyes off the bag in Officer Harris's hands. The clothes, neatly folded, had a dark, foreboding quality to them. They didn't belong to anyone in his family. They didn't belong to anyone he recognized. "Whose are these?" Brian demanded, his voice trembling. "Why are you showing me this?" Harris remained silent for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "They were found in your wife's closet, Brian." Brian blinked, processing the officer's words. "What? No, that's impossible. These aren't mine or Lisa's. They must have been left here by mistake." Harris shook his head slowly. "These clothes are new, Brian. They're not old. And the most disturbing part? They're not from any store around here. We traced the tags and they don't match anything sold locally. Brian's mind spun. How could this be happening? His thoughts raced faster than he could process them. How could there be something else in this house that he had never seen before? He tried to focus, but the idea that someone other than his family, had been in their home, possibly in Lisa's closet, sent a chill down his spine. These could have just been left here by someone who came over, Brian stammered. But even as he said it, he knew it sounded weak, like a desperate attempt to make sense of the impossible. But Officer Harris didn't look convinced. We don't think so. These clothes look too new too, out of place, and there's something else. He paused, letting the silence sink in. We found traces of perfume on them, Brian. A distinct scent. Brian's stomach dropped. What are you implying? He almost didn't want to hear the answer. It felt like his entire world was crumbling, piece by piece. Officer Harris took a deep breath before continuing. We're implying that someone was in your home, someone who isn't supposed to be here, and it's looking more and more like your wife knew this person. A person she might have been hiding something from you. Brian's heart pounded in his chest. He could feel the walls of his own home growing unfamiliar, foreign. Everything was slipping away. No, that's impossible. Lisa wouldn't hide anything from me. We were fine. I don't understand. The officer's face softened for just a moment, but his voice remained firm. Sometimes the people we love keep secrets, Brian. And sometimes those secrets have dangerous consequences. Brian shook his head, disbelief washing over him. He could feel the pressure building in his chest. It was as if he was suffocating under the weight of it all. How could you even suggest that? Brian's voice cracked. Lisa's dead, and now you're telling me that she was hiding something from me? Harris didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Brian with an expression that was hard to read. We're not here to judge, Brian. We're just trying to figure out what happened. Brian's mind was racing now, trying to process the flood of thoughts that kept rushing in. Emma's words, Daddy did it. Was that a clue? Was that the reason she had said it? He glanced around the room. Everything was the same, but at the same time, nothing was. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a crime scene. His own family's history was being questioned. And the most terrifying part? He didn't know what was real anymore. Where's Emma? Brian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Where is she? Harris sighed. She's safe. She's staying with her aunt. We don't want her here while we sort through things, but you'll be able to see her soon. Brian's stomach twisted with guilt. His daughter, the one person he had promised to protect, had witnessed something terrible. But what? The officer cleared his throat. There's one more thing we need to talk about. Brian froze. His heart hammered in his chest, and he braced himself for the worst. What else could there possibly be? He muttered, his voice full of anguish. Harris pulled out a small piece of paper from his jacket pocket. He unfolded it carefully, as if it was something fragile. He held it up for Brian to see. It was a photograph. Brian's eyes went wide. The picture was of a man, someone he didn't recognize. He looked to be in his late 30s, dark hair, and an intense gaze that sent a shiver down Brian's spine. Who is this? Brian asked, his voice low. This was found in Lisa's things. It's one of the first things we discovered when we searched the house, Harris explained. We've been trying to identify him, but we know one thing for sure, this man had been in your house. Brian stared at the photo, his mind racing. Who was this? And why was his picture in Lisa's possession? This doesn't make sense, Brian said, his voice rising. I don't know this man. Lisa would have told me if she was seeing someone else. We were happy. Why are you showing me this? Harris put the photo back into his jacket pocket, his expression unreadable. We're just trying to figure out the connections, Brian. But this man is linked to something bigger, something we think could explain what happened to your wife. Brian's world was unraveling faster than he could comprehend. There was a stranger in his home. His wife had kept secrets, and now, somehow, His daughter seemed to know things she shouldn't. A storm of confusion and dread clouded his thoughts. "Please," Brian whispered, his voice breaking. "Just tell me what's going on." Officer Harris met his eyes, and for the first time, Brian saw something resembling sympathy there. But it didn't help. "It's not over yet," Harris said quietly. "But we'll get to the bottom of it, Brian, I promise. Just don't leave town." And with that, he turned, walking toward the door, leaving Brian standing alone in the house he once knew so well. As the door clicked shut, Brian felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. Who had been in his house? Who was this man, and why was Emma so sure it was him? Brian stood alone in the living room, his hand gripping the back of the couch, his body frozen in a state of shock. Officer Harris's words echoed in his head, "Don't leave town." His mind couldn't fully process everything that had happened in the past few hours, but one thing was clear. His life, his world had shattered. The photo of the stranger, the clothes, Emma's cryptic words, the perfume, and the unanswered questions. It felt like pieces of a puzzle, yet none of them fit together. And the more Brian thought about it, the more he realized that there was something deeply wrong in every corner of his life. Something that had always been there, hidden in plain sight. He shook his head, trying to dispel the growing dread that enveloped him. Who was this man? What was his connection to Lisa? Just then, a sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. His heart skipped. It was late in the evening, and he hadn't been expecting anyone. Opening the door slowly, Brian found his sister-in-law, Megan, standing on the doorstep. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with concern. "Brian," Megan started, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry, but I need to talk to you about Emma." Brian's heart sank. Emma, his daughter, the innocent little girl who had already seen too much. "What? About Emma?" His voice cracked, panic creeping into his tone. He stepped aside to let Megan in, closing the door behind her. "She's been asking about Lisa," Megan said softly, her gaze darting to the floor. "She keeps saying things that don't make sense, and she's been saying them to everyone, to the doctors, to the police, even to me." Brian's stomach twisted into knots. "What kinds of things?" Megan took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "She said that Lisa wasn't really dead, that she was going to come back." Brian blinked. "What? That doesn't make any sense. She's 4 years old. She doesn't understand what happened. This is just her way of coping." But even as he spoke the words, he wasn't sure he believed them himself. "That's not all, Brian," Megan continued, her voice barely a whisper. "She also keeps saying that her mommy was sleeping." Megan looked up at Brian, her face full of worry. "Do you know what that means?" "She said it's the last thing Lisa told her before she died." Brian's mind reeled. Sleep? Was it possible that Emma knew something? Something that none of them understood? He felt a cold chill creeping up his spine. Could his daughter have known something about Lisa's death that no one else did? "Where is she now?" Brian asked urgently. Megan hesitated. "She's with the police. They're talking to her, trying to understand what she meant." She placed a hand on Brian's shoulder, looking into his eyes. "I think we both know that there's more going on here, Brian. There's something we're missing, something we haven't been told." Brian stared at Megan for a long moment, processing her words. He could see the fear in her eyes, the worry that mirrored his own. He had to protect Emma, but what if she knew something that could unlock the entire mystery of Lisa's death? "Do you think she's lying?" Brian asked, his voice low and uncertain. "No," Megan replied quickly, shaking her head. "I don't think she's lying. I think she's trying to make sense of something she doesn't understand. And I think we need to listen to her. She's trying to tell us something." Brian rubbed his temples, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. The mystery of Lisa's death had only deepened. First the stranger, then the strange clothes, and now Emma's disturbing words. Nothing made sense. But one thing was clear. He couldn't face this alone. He needed answers. "We're going to find out the truth, Megan. We'll figure out what happened I won't let this go. I need to know who killed Lisa and why. Megan nodded. I'll help you, Brian, but we have to be careful. The more we dig, the more dangerous it gets. Brian looked up at her, his eyes filled with determination. I don't care. I need to know the truth. For Emma. Suddenly, a knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Brian turned to see Officer Harris standing there once again, his expression grave. We need to talk, Harris said, his voice tight. Brian's heart raced. What now? The air was heavy, with the unspoken words hanging between Brian and Officer Harris as the officer stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room briefly before he closed the door behind him. Brian, we need to go over some things. Officer Harris began, his voice calm, yet there was an edge to it that made Brian's skin crawl. There's been a new development in the investigation. Brian swallowed hard, trying to suppress the growing, feeling that something was about to change. What could it be now? He glanced at Megan, who was standing by the window, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. She was watching Harris, her face an unreadable mask. New development? Brian repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Harris nodded. Yes. We've found something that might change the direction of the case. Brian's pulse quickened. A clue? A witness? His mind raced with possibilities. I need to be clear with you, Brian, Officer Harris continued, his tone lowering as he pulled out a folder from under his arm. He opened it, sliding a photograph across the coffee table in front of Brian. This man was at the house the day Lisa died. Brian looked at the photograph. The man was familiar, but only vaguely. He was tall, dark-haired, with sharp features and a cold, expressionless face. Brian felt his heart sink as he stared at the image. Who is he? Brian asked, his voice tight. We don't know yet, Harris replied. But what we do know is that this man was seen leaving the house just hours before Lisa was found. We've tracked him to a hotel not far from here. He checked in the same evening, under an alias. Brian's mind was reeling. An alias? A stranger in the house? It felt like the walls were closing in around him. His once peaceful life shattered into 1,000 fragmented pieces. He looked up at Harris, unable to hide the confusion in his eyes. What does this mean? Brian asked, trying to keep his voice steady. What does this guy have to do with my wife's death? Harris sighed, a tired, almost resigned look crossing his face. We're working on that. But there's something more you need to know. We've questioned several of the neighbors, and some of them heard strange noises the night before Lisa was found. Voices, things being moved around inside the house. Brian felt the blood drain from his face. His stomach twisted into knots as he tried to grasp the magnitude of what was being said. His mind spun back to the night before, his argument with Lisa, her strange behavior in the days leading up to her death. But he never imagined that someone could have been inside the house, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I don't understand, Brian muttered, shaking his head. How could I not have known? Megan stepped forward, her voice quiet but steady. Brian, listen to me. What if this man was part of something bigger? Something you didn't know about? Maybe Lisa was involved in something she kept hidden from you. Brian turned to her, his heart sinking deeper. What do you mean, Megan? What could she possibly have been involved in? Megan looked at Officer Harris before turning back to Brian. I don't know, but this man, he looks familiar to me. I swear I've seen him before. It's like he was always around, lurking in the background. Brian felt a cold chill run down his spine. What was Megan implying? Was there something she knew that she hadn't told him? Harris seemed to sense the tension. He raised his hand, silencing the room. Let me finish, there's more. We've also found traces of a substance in the house, something unusual. We're still testing it, but it's a lead. It could explain a lot of things, but before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I need you to understand something. Brian's eyes locked onto Harris's. What is it? Harris's gaze was intense. Whatever this man's involvement is with your wife's death, it's not just about Lisa anymore. It's about you, Brian. It's about Emma. We believe you're in danger too. A shudder ran through Brian as those words landed. Danger. It felt surreal, like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. He looked over at Megan, but she was just as shocked, her lips trembling. Harris stood, his face hardening. I'm going to need your full cooperation, Brian. We need to move fast. The more you know, the more you'll be able to protect yourself. And your daughter, Brian nodded slowly, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't know what kind of danger he was facing, but he could feel it closing in, lurking in every shadow. For the first time, he realized that his fight wasn't just to uncover the truth about Lisa's death. It was to protect the only family he had left. He stood up, his voice firm. I'm in. I'll do whatever it takes. The tension in the room had shifted. What had started as a conversation about Lisa's death had now transformed into a race against time. A race Brian was no longer sure he was ready to run. He stood in front of Officer Harris and Megan, feeling a weight in his chest. His heart pounded faster than it should, and his mind struggled to keep up with the unfolding nightmare. Danger. That word still echoed in his ears. Harris had made it clear that there was more to the story than just a tragic loss. The sense of dread grew, stronger with every passing second. I'll cooperate, Brian repeated, but it felt almost like a mantra, something he had to say, but wasn't sure he fully understood the consequences of. He looked at Megan, who met his gaze with concern in her eyes. She had been quiet, watching the entire exchange between the officer and Brian, but now she spoke softly, almost as if she was testing the waters. Brian, Megan started, her voice tentative. We need to be careful. Whatever's going on with this man, this stranger, Lisa might have known more than we think. Her words hit Brian hard. Megan had known Lisa just as well as he did. What was she trying to say? That there was a side of Lisa he never saw? The idea gnawed at him, but it was a thought he couldn't afford to linger on for too long. You're right, Brian said, forcing himself to focus. We need to figure out what this guy's connection to Lisa really is, and why he's connected to this whole thing. Harris, who had been silent for a moment, nodded gravely. That's why we need you to stay sharp. You don't know this man. At least you don't think you do. But we've traced his connections. He's linked to a lot of people you don't want to be involved with, Brian. We're not sure how deep Lisa was involved, but we're getting close. Brian's stomach twisted. The idea of Lisa being involved with someone like this man, someone who was connected to shady figures, was almost too much to bear. But he couldn't stop now. His wife was dead, his daughter was grieving, and now there were forces working against them both. He was already too far in. Megan spoke again, her tone more urgent this time. Brian, you need to start thinking. When was the last time you saw Lisa with someone strange? Was there anyone she was hiding from you? Any odd behavior in the days leading up to her death? Brian tried to think, his mind racing back to the last moments he spent with Lisa. It felt like an eternity ago, but in reality it was only a few weeks. He could still picture their last argument. It had been about Emma, about their daughter's future, and things had gotten heated. But nothing about it felt connected to what was happening now. No, he muttered, shaking his head. No, nothing. Out of the ordinary. She was just distant for a while. But I assumed it was stress. We were both overwhelmed. I didn't push her to talk. Megan's face was soft, but her words cut deep. She wasn't the type to open up easily, was she? She said quietly. She always kept things to herself, but that doesn't mean she didn't know things we didn't. If she was in over her head with someone, maybe it's not too late to find out what she knew. Brian closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words. He had loved Lisa, loved her. How could he have missed something this important? How could he have been so blind to the things happening around him? Before he could respond, Harris interrupted. We've got something, the officer said, his voice low. A lead on that man from the photograph. We've tracked him to a warehouse on the outskirts of town. We're sending a team to check it out. But I need to know, Brian, if this man is involved, do you have any idea who would want to hurt Lisa? Brian's heart skipped a beat. He had no answers, not yet. When he stopped, a cold chill creeping up his spine. Was there someone who would have hurt Lisa? Someone who could have been involved in this dark, twisted plot? His thoughts were interrupted as Harris leaned forward, a slight urgency in his movements. "We don't have much time. I need to know everything you remember, Brian, every detail." Brian's mind was a blur, but one thought stuck out. One nagging, relentless thought. The night before Lisa died, she had been talking about something. She had said something cryptic, something about not being able to run anymore. Brian had brushed it off, thinking it was just her way of dealing with stress, but now, those words felt like a distant warning. "I don't know," Brian said, his voice a whisper. "But I remember her saying something strange. It was the night before she said she couldn't run anymore." Megan frowned. "Couldn't run? From what?" Brian shook his head. "I don't know. I didn't think it was anything important. But now..." He trailed off, his mind racing. Harris stood up, his expression serious. "That's it. That's the key. Running. It's possible Lisa was trying to escape from something, or someone. The officer turned to leave. He shot a quick look at Brian and Megan. "We're heading to that warehouse now. I need you both to stay put. Don't do anything rash." But Brian couldn't stand by. Not now. Not when he was this close to the truth. "I'm coming with you," he said, his voice determined. Harris paused, his eyes hard. "This is dangerous, Brian. You're not trained for this." "I don't care," Brian shot back. "I need to know what happened. I have to." Megan placed a hand on Brian's arm, her grip firm. "He's right, Brian. You're too emotionally involved. In this, you need to let them handle it." Brian shook his head, the resolve growing inside him. "I'm going, whether you like it or not." The streets outside the police station were quiet, an eerie stillness settling over the town. The kind of stillness that came only after a storm had passed, when the damage had been done, and the world was too tired to even breathe. But Brian wasn't tired. He wasn't tired of chasing answers, not anymore. Megan had tried to reason with him, but she could see in his eyes that it was too late. The fire inside him had been lit, and there was no turning back. He couldn't sit idly by while his wife's mysterious death slipped further into the shadows. Lisa deserved answers. Emma deserved answers. And even if it meant walking into the unknown, Brian would find them. The police car sped through the night, its lights flashing red and blue, illuminating the darkened streets. Harris, who had reluctantly agreed to let Brian come along, drove with tense hands on the wheel. He kept glancing at Brian in the rearview mirror, as if he were trying to gauge whether the man was truly ready for what lay ahead. "You sure about this, Brian?" Harris asked, his voice clipped, as though he were unsure whether to be protective or angry. Brian stared out the window, his eyes unblinking, his jaw tight. "I'm sure. I need to know what happened to her. All of it." Megan was sitting beside him in the back seat, her expression conflicted, a mix of concern and disbelief. She didn't understand why Brian was doing this to himself. He wasn't trained for this kind of thing, not at all. But there was something in his eyes, a drive that seemed to transcend logic. Maybe it was grief, or maybe it was guilt, but either way it was powerful. "You don't have to do this," Megan whispered, her hand finding Brian's in the dark. "We can let the police handle it. We've already given them everything we know." Brian's grip tightened on her hand, the warmth of her touch both comforting and painful. "I can't let it go, Meg. She was my wife. I have to understand why she was running from something. Someone." His words hung heavy in the air, and Megan's expression softened. She knew deep down that there was nothing she could say to change his mind. The man sitting beside her wasn't just her brother-in-law. He was a man broken by grief, and when people were broken, they did things no one could understand. The car turned sharply, its tires screeching as it slowed near the outskirts of town. The lights from the city faded away, replaced by the desolate industrial landscape that marked the beginning of a different world. They were heading to the warehouse now, the location Harris had tracked down after their earlier conversation. The mysterious man, the one linked to Lisa's death, was connected to that place. And now, so were they. Harris parked the car a few hundred yards from the entrance. The warehouse loomed ahead, its dark silhouette casting an ominous shadow across the ground. It was the kind of place where secrets festered, where no one asked questions, and where things went to disappear. Brian's heart raced as he stared at the imposing structure, its silence almost deafening. "I don't like this," Megan muttered, her voice tight with fear. "It doesn't feel right." Brian gave her a long, heavy look, his eyes hard. "I can't back down now. Not after everything we've been through. If there's something in there, we have to know." Harris sighed deeply, pulling a flashlight from his jacket. "All right, but you stay behind me, both of you. We're not dealing with a typical situation here." The three of them stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at their skin. As they approached the warehouse, the only sounds were the crunching of gravel beneath their feet and the distant hum of city life now far behind them. The closer they got, the more Brian's mind raced. Who was this man? Why had Lisa been involved with him? And why had she been so terrified in the days before her death? They reached the entrance, and Harris pushed open a rusted door with a groan that echoed through the night. The inside was dark, with only a faint light coming from an overhead bulb that flickered sporadically. The smell of oil and rust hung in the air, and the floor beneath their feet was damp, the concrete slick with something Brian couldn't quite identify. "Stay close," Harris muttered, shining his flashlight around the room. "We don't know what we're walking into." Brian followed close behind, his hand on the hilt of a small gun that Harris had insisted he carry for protection. It felt heavy in his palm, but he couldn't deny the sense of unease gnawing at him. This wasn't the kind of place you wanted to be without a weapon. They moved through the shadows, each footstep cautious, each breath shallow. The warehouse stretched on, its walls lined with crates and boxes that seemed to hold more than just ordinary merchandise. There was something about the place that felt wrong, as if it had seen too much, kept too many secrets, and now those secrets were coming to the surface. Suddenly, a faint noise cut through the silence, a soft rustling from one of the back corners. Harris immediately raised his flashlight and Brian's heart skipped a beat. Someone was here. "Get down!" Harris barked, pushing Megan and Brian behind a stack of crates. His flashlight swung wildly in the dark, trying to catch sight of the intruder. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dark jacket. His face was partially obscured by a baseball cap, but Brian could make out the sharpness in his features, the hardened look in his eyes. This was the man. Before Brian could speak, the figure turned, his eyes locking with Harris's, and a smirk spread across his face. "Well, well, well," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. "You actually came." Brian's chest tightened as the man took a step forward, his hands slowly raised, as if daring them to make a move. Harris kept the flashlight trained on him, but it was clear that the situation was about to spiral out of control. "Who are you?" Brian demanded, stepping forward despite the pounding in his chest. "What did you do to my wife?" The man's grin only grew wider. "I didn't do anything, but your wife. She was involved in something far bigger than you know." Harris's eyes widened. "I thought you were dead." The man's lips curled in a cold smile. "Dead? No, just forgotten." And with that, the air seemed to grow colder, heavier. Brian's thoughts spun as the figure's words sank in. There were things about Lisa's life he hadn't known, things that were now far too dangerous to ignore. In the flickering light, Brian finally realized one thing. This was only the beginning. The silence in the warehouse was almost unbearable as Brian stared at the man in front of him. The air around them seemed thick with tension, every inch of space laden with unspoken threats. The man's smirk never wavered as he took a step forward, his presence menacing yet eerily composed. Brian's heart hammered in his chest, his mind racing to process the flood of questions flooding his thoughts. "What do you mean bigger than I know?" he asked, his voice tight. Every muscle in his body was on alert, as if anticipating a sudden attack. The man's eyes glinted with dark amusement. He tilted his head slightly, as if sizing Brian up. You really think your wife was just a simple woman, huh? That she was just some frightened little thing who stumbled into something she didn't understand? His words dripped with contempt. Brian clenched his fists, biting down on his frustration. Tell me who you are, and what you did to her, he demanded, his voice rising despite the fear that twisted in his stomach. Harris stepped forward, his voice firm. Stay calm, Brian. Let him talk. The man shifted his gaze toward Harris, his expression darkening for a moment before he spoke. The name's Luke Donovan, he said slowly. And your wife, Lisa. She was involved with people who don't take kindly to anyone digging too deep. But you wouldn't know that, would you? Brian felt his stomach tighten. No, I didn't know. How was she involved? He had to know. This was the missing piece, the truth he'd been searching for, since the moment Lisa had died. Donovan's smirk faded slightly as he took another step forward. She got in too deep, and it wasn't just her life at risk, it was her daughter's too. She was trying to protect her, but I'm afraid she didn't succeed. The words hit Brian like a physical blow. Lisa had been protecting Emma? His chest tightened as a flood of images, of moments with Emma, of Lisa's fearful expressions, rushed through his mind. Had she known she was in danger? Had she been running from something that Brian hadn't understood? Protecting her, Megan echoed, stepping closer to Brian. From what? Luke's eyes flicked to Megan, and his smirk returned, though this time it seemed darker. From people who don't hesitate to destroy everything in their path to get what they want. People who won't stop until they get their hands on Emma. Brian's blood ran cold. What do you mean? What do they want with Emma? Luke's face hardened. I don't have all the details, but I know this much. Lisa got tangled up in something much bigger than any of you realize. There are people in this town, and far beyond, who are playing a game they've been playing for years. And now they've set their sights on your little girl. Megan gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Emma. Brian's thoughts whirled, but he couldn't let his fear show. He couldn't break down now. Emma was in danger, and if Lisa had known that, if Lisa had been fighting to protect her, Brian had to understand what his wife had gotten herself into, and why it had cost her life. Who else is involved? Brian asked, his voice hard now, determined. Who are these people? Luke took a long breath, stepping back slightly. He seemed to consider his next words carefully, as if weighing whether it was worth saying more. The people you're dealing with aren't amateurs. They've been in the shadows for years, pulling strings, running operations. Lisa got too close. She found something she shouldn't have, and that's why she's dead. But why would they target Emma? Megan's voice was trembling, her face pale with fear. Luke's gaze softened ever so slightly, almost like he was pitying them. Emma's the key. She's the last piece they need to finish what they've started. If you want to keep her safe, you're going to have to step carefully, and I mean carefully. Brian's breath hitched and his hands clenched at his sides. Where is she now? Is she in danger right this minute? Luke's face darkened again, and he turned toward the shadows of the warehouse, as if contemplating something deep. I don't know exactly where she is now. But you should be asking yourself a much bigger question. Who is after her? Brian and Megan exchanged a look, one of unspoken dread and urgency. The pieces were falling into place, but they were far from understanding the full picture. You're saying we can't trust anyone? Megan whispered, her voice tight with fear. Luke nodded slowly. Not unless they've proven themselves trustworthy. And that's rare, even in my line of work. Brian's thoughts spun. The danger that had been just an abstract feeling now felt real. Too real. Emma, his sweet little niece, was now a pawn in a game of life and death. And the only thing standing between her and whatever darkness was lurking out there was him. Tell us what to do, Brian said, his voice low and full of purpose. What's our next step? Luke paused for a long moment, his gaze flickering between the two of them. First, you get out of here. Get Emma somewhere safe, somewhere no one can find her. What about you? Megan asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. What's stopping them from coming for you too? Luke's lips curled into a faint, almost bitter smile. They'll come for me too, but I'll be ready. Then help us, Brian urged, his desperation beginning to break through his usual calm. Help us protect her. Luke didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the shadows, as if listening for something in the distance. A moment later, he turned back, his face grim. Don't trust anyone, not even the police, he warned. They're already involved in this mess. There's too much at stake. The finality of his words settled heavily over them. Brian felt his world tipping on its axis, every step forward seeming like a descent into something darker, something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Luke gave them a final glance before turning and disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. For a moment, no one moved. Finally, Megan whispered, "We need to go now." Brian nodded, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts, but one thing was clear above all else. Emma was the key. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The night had fallen, and the weight of Luke's words hung in the air like a thick fog. Brian and Megan sat in the car, staring into the dimly lit street ahead, both of them silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Emma. She was all that mattered now. The danger to her was real, and the last thing they wanted was to lose her too. Where do we even start? Megan finally spoke, her voice breaking the silence. She sounded exhausted, but her worry for Emma kept her wide-eyed and alert. Do we go to the police? Can we trust them? Brian turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring, to life, but his mind was elsewhere. Luke says we can't trust anyone, he replied, his voice cold but underlined with fear. But we have no choice but to act fast. Megan's gaze was distant. I can't believe this is happening. I never thought Lisa was involved in something like this. Neither did I, Brian admitted, the weight of that truth heavy in his chest. But we have to focus. We need to get Emma safe, and I have no idea who we can rely on anymore. Can't just sit here doing nothing. Megan nodded slowly, biting her lip. Okay, so what now? Brian didn't answer immediately. His mind was spinning, trying to process everything he'd just heard. There was too much to absorb. Lisa had been involved in something dangerous, something that now put her daughter's life at risk. And the people behind it? They were ruthless. This wasn't just about a missing person anymore. This was a fight for survival. He glanced at Megan. First, we need to get to Emma, make sure she's still at the house. He paused. And we need to move her fast. If we stay in one place too long, they'll find us. And Luke, he's right, we can't trust the cops. Not yet. Megan's eyes widened. What about our families? Shouldn't we at least call them? No. Brian's voice was firm. If we tell anyone, we risk putting them in the crossfire. We can't afford that. Megan nodded, but there was a visible crack in her resolve. She was scared, and Brian couldn't blame her. He was scared too. But they had no time to waste. They needed to get Emma out of that house before whatever force was hunting them found her first. The drive to Emma's house felt like it took forever, but in reality it was just a few minutes. The city streets blurred as Brian's thoughts drifted back to Lisa. His wife had been a pillar of strength, loving and fiercely protective of Emma. Whatever secret she had uncovered, whatever dark truth had cost her life, he was determined to uncover it for Lisa and for Emma. When they pulled up in front of the house, everything seemed eerily quiet. The porch light was on, casting a soft glow over the front yard. No sign of trouble, but Brian knew better than to trust appearances. This was far from over. We're here, Megan whispered, her eyes scanning the area, looking for any signs of danger. Brian nodded, taking a deep breath. Stay close, and be ready for anything. They got out of the car, their footsteps heavy on the gravel driveway. Brian could feel his heart racing, the air cold against his skin. Everything seemed off, too still. He didn't like it. The house loomed before them, its windows dark. As they reached the door, Brian hesitated. Should they knock? Should they force their way in? Megan noticed his hesitation and whispered, What if Emma's not inside? I don't know, but we're not leaving until we're sure, Brian replied, his voice tight. He pushed the door open slowly, the creak of the hinges too loud in the silence. They stepped inside, and the first thing that hit Brian was the scent, the familiar smell of home, of Lisa's perfume mixed with the faintest hint of stale air. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. Emma? Brian called softly, stepping into the living room. No answer. Megan went to the staircase. Emma? But still there was no reply. The house seemed empty, as if Emma had vanished. Brian's pulse quickened. Where is she? Megan whispered, her voice trembling. Brian didn't have an answer. I don't know. Let's check her room. They made their way down the hallway, every creak of the floorboards amplifying the tension between them. Brian's mind raced. Could someone have taken Emma? Had she been moved? And if she had, where could she be? He reached for the door handle to Emma's room, his hand shaking. With a deep breath, he swung it open. The room was dark, but everything seemed in its place. The bed was neatly made, her favorite stuffed animals lined up on the shelf. Nothing was out of the ordinary, nothing except for one thing. The window was open. Brian's breath caught in his throat. No, 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 no! He rushed over to the window, looking out into the night. It was dark out there, but there was a faint trail in the grass, footsteps leading away from the house. Megan stepped up behind him. Oh God, she's gone, isn't she? Brian swallowed, hard, staring at the trail of footsteps. His heart was pounding now, each beat driving him forward. We need to follow them, he said, voice strained. We need to find her, before it's too late. They ran out of the house, their feet pounding against the gravel driveway as they followed the trail. It led toward the woods behind the house, where the trees seemed to swallow the night whole. The darkness ahead of them seemed endless, and then, just as they neared the edge of the woods, Brian stopped dead in his tracks. There, just a few feet ahead of them, standing beneath the shadow of a tree, was Emma. Her small figure stood motionless, staring into the darkness, a blank expression on her face. Emma! Megan cried out, running toward her. But Emma didn't respond, she didn't even flinch. Brian's heart stopped. Something was terribly wrong. The tension in the air was suffocating as Brian and Megan entered the small, dimly lit apartment. The door shut behind them with a muffled click, and for a moment the silence was deafening. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the alley, each lost in their own thoughts, each grappling with the weight of the situation that seemed to be spiraling out of control. Megan collapsed onto the threadbare couch, running her hands through her hair, her eyes distant, lost in some dark place. Brian paced the room, his mind racing, trying to piece together the puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with each passing moment. I can't believe this is happening, Megan murmured, barely audible. How did we get here? Brian stopped pacing, his back to her as he stared out the window. He didn't have a clear answer. In some way, he felt as though they were too deep in it now, too far gone to turn back. Everything about the past few, didn't the sudden death of his sister, Emma's strange behavior, Luke's warnings, the cryptic messages, it all felt like it had been orchestrated, but by who and why? His mind kept circling back to one thing: Emma. Just that morning she had been calm, almost serene, playing with her toys, unaware of the looming danger. Now, she was the center of a storm. Brian's instincts told him that the more they stayed in one place, the closer they got to being discovered. But moving again was risky. Suddenly there was a soft knock at the door, sending a jolt of panic through Brian's body. He spun around, heart in his throat, and caught Megan's wide-eyed stare. "Who is it?" she whispered urgently. Brian didn't know how to respond. They weren't expecting anyone. Could it be Luke? Or worse, someone else? The ones who had been following them all along? They had no idea how close they were to finding them. "Stay quiet," he whispered to Megan, before edging toward the door. He glanced through the peephole and his heart dropped into his stomach. Standing on the other side was a familiar face. Detective Wallace, the same detective who had been investigating his sister's death. The same man who had been around more. than he'd ever realized. Brian's pulse quickened as he pressed his back against the door, his mind racing for options. He couldn't afford to be caught now. They couldn't afford to be seen, not after everything that had happened. But running was impossible. They were cornered. Megan noticed the panic in his eyes. "What's going on?" she whispered. Brian didn't answer. Instead, he glanced around the room, trying to make a decision, trying to figure out the safest way out. He noticed a small window at the far end of the room. It was barely big enough for a person to crawl through, but if they had to, it could be their only escape. He turned to Megan, his voice barely above a breath. "We have to go. Now." But before they could make another move, the detective knocked again, louder this time, his voice filtering through the door. "I know you're in there, Brian. We need to talk. Open up." Brian's heart pounded as his mind raced, torn between the need to confront the detective and the overwhelming desire to escape before they were caught. He didn't trust Detective Wallace, not anymore. The man had always seemed too comfortable around the case, too willing to push past certain questions. Brian was beginning to wonder if Wallace had more to do with his sister's death than anyone had realized. But what was his angle? What was he after? "Do you think he knows we're here?" Megan whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know, but he's not leaving until we answer him." Brian's voice was grim. The seconds felt like hours as Brian's mind scrambled for a plan. The window. They had to move fast. "Get to the window," he told Megan firmly, his eyes scanning the door. "I'll keep him distracted." Megan looked at him, fear etched on her face. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you. Just go." With trembling hands, Megan hurried to the window, her movements quick and silent. She tried to open it but found it stuck, the old hinges protesting. Behind her, the detective knocked again, his voice now tinged with impatience. "Brian, open up now. I'm not playing games. I know you're in there." Brian's chest tightened, but he couldn't afford to panic. He stepped toward the door, taking a deep breath. "I'm coming," he called out, trying to steady his voice. Megan finally managed to open the window with a sharp, muffled crack. She scrambled through it as quietly as possible, then turned back to Brian. "Go," she urged. Brian gave her a brief nod, but his mind was racing. He opened the door just a crack, peering through it. Detective Wallace was standing there, his face expressionless but his posture tense, as if expecting Brian to answer at any moment. "Detective," Brian said, his voice tight, trying to sound calm. "What's this about?" Wallace stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "I need to ask you some questions about your sister, about Emma." Brian's heart sank. The last thing he needed was to be pulled into a conversation with the detective. Not now. Not when they were so close to getting out. "I've already told you everything I know," Brian replied, his words strained. "I don't know why she died, and I don't know why you keep bringing me in for questioning." Wallace's expression hardened. "I'm not playing games, Brian. I've been watching you, watching both of you." Before Brian could react, the detective's eyes flicked toward the window where Megan had just disappeared. "I think you're running," Wallace said, his voice low and dangerous. Brian felt the air shift around him, the walls closing in. This was it. The detective knew. He had to act fast. In a single desperate move, Brian shoved the door wide open, slamming into Wallace's chest and knocking him back. The detective stumbled, momentarily stunned, giving Brian just enough time to lunge for the window. "Run!" he shouted. Megan had already disappeared into the night, but Brian followed her, the cold air hitting his face as he scrambled through the narrow opening. His heart hammered in his chest as he landed on the ground, his knees buckling slightly from the jump. Behind him, he heard Wallace's enraged shouts, but there was no time to look back. They had to get out. Now. The night was suffocating, as if the very air was conspiring against them. Brian barely had time to catch his breath before the sound of Detective Wallace's shouts echoed from the alley. Too close for comfort. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest like a drumbeat. Megan was already ahead of him, her silhouette barely visible in the dim streetlights as she ran toward the shadows. They had to move faster. Brian's legs burned as he sprinted after her, the fear of being caught propelling him forward, every step quicker than the last. The city streets, once familiar, now felt like a maze, full of hiding places and dangers lurking in the dark. He had never felt so vulnerable. "Megan!" he called out, his voice cracking with urgency. She didn't look back, didn't stop to wait. Megan had always been the brave one between them, but tonight the fear in her movements was palpable. The situation had escalated far beyond what either of them had anticipated. They weren't just running from the detective anymore. They were running from something much bigger, and whatever it was, they could feel its presence closing in around them. They ducked into an alleyway, the narrow walls seeming to press in on them as they slowed down to catch their breath. Megan's chest heaved, her face pale, but her eyes were wide with a mixture of determination and terror. "Do you think he saw us?" Megan whispered, her voice trembling as she peered cautiously over her shoulder. Brian shook his head, although doubt gnawed at him. He had no idea how much Wallace knew, but one thing was certain. The detective was onto them. He had to be. That gut-wrenching look in his eyes, the way he'd eyed the window. Brian's suspicions about Wallace were becoming harder to ignore. "We need to keep moving," Brian said, his voice low but firm. "If he catches up—" "I know," Megan interrupted. "But where do we go, Brian? Where can we hide?" Brian didn't have an answer for that. The world felt like it was closing in on them from all sides. He thought about Emma. She was still out there, alone, in that dark house, with no one but him to protect her. And the more he ran, the more the guilt grew. What if they couldn't get to her in time? What if they were already too late? "Megan," Brian began, his voice shaking. "We have to get Emma. She's the only reason we're running like this." "I know," Megan replied softly. "But we can't just charge. Back in there, Brian. If Wallace is involved, if anyone else is involved." She trailed off, her eyes dark with fear and uncertainty. It was clear that she was just as scared as he was, but there was a hardness to her expression too. The kind of resolve that had always kept her going in. "The hardest of times. You're right," Brian said, trying to pull himself together. "We need to think this through. We can't do anything rash." The sound of footsteps echoed down the alleyway, freezing both of them in place. Brian held his breath, eyes wide as he strained to hear. The footsteps grew louder, and the last thing he needed was for Detective Wallace to catch up with them now. His mind raced. What could they do? How could they get out of this? There was no easy answer. They had no allies, no safe place to turn. But as the footsteps neared, Brian's mind finally clicked into survival mode. He grabbed Megan's arm, pulling her deeper, into the alley, away from the main street, urging her to move faster. They came to a dead end. A brick wall stood in their way, but the alley kept curving to the left. It wasn't much of a choice, but it was all they had. They sprinted to the corner, where the alley split off into another narrow path, and hid behind a dumpster, holding their breath. The footsteps were now only a few feet away, too close for comfort. Brian's pulse hammered in his ears, and Megan's hand gripped his tightly, as though she was afraid he might slip away from her in the chaos. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. But then, just as the sound of the footsteps reached its peak, they stopped. Brian held his breath, listening for any movement, any sign that the detective had spotted them. But nothing came. They waited in agonizing silence, the air thick with the smell of garbage and the distant hum of traffic. Time seemed to slow down, and Brian's thoughts swirled in a haze of confusion, fear, and dread. It was as if they were waiting for a storm to break, waiting for the inevitable crash. And then, just as Brian was about to peek around the dumpster, a new sound broke through the silence. It was distant at first, almost like a faint rumble in the ground, but it grew louder. A car. The sound of tires screeching against the pavement, racing toward them. "Brian," Megan whispered urgently, her voice tight. "What if it's him?" Brian didn't know what to think anymore. His entire world had turned upside down, and with it, the line between who to trust and who to fear was blurring. He waited. peeking out just enough to catch a glimpse of the car as it sped down the alley. It wasn't Wallace's car. It was a black SUV, sleek and professional looking, but it wasn't the same detective's car they'd seen earlier. Brian's heart dropped as the vehicle screeched to a halt just a few yards from where they were hiding. A door opened. Heavy footsteps approached. "Megan," Brian whispered fiercely, "we need to move, now!" He didn't know who was in the SUV, but there was no time to find out. They had no other choice but to run. With a final look at the car, Brian pulled Megan's arm, dragging her toward the far end of the alley. Their footsteps were silent, but their hearts were thundering in their chests as they darted from shadow to shadow. They had no idea where they were going, no plan, no way out. But one thing was clear: they couldn't stop. Whatever game they were caught in, whatever web of lies and danger they'd been pulled into, it was only going to get worse. But they couldn't stop now. There was too much at stake. They had to keep running. The morning light crept through the cracks in the boarded-up windows of the small hideout where Brian and Megan had taken refuge. They hadn't slept much, their way. Bodies exhausted, but their minds racing, unable to escape the darkness that had descended on their lives. The night's escape had brought no comfort, only a brief respite from the terrifying chase. The truth, however, was more elusive than ever. Megan sat across from Brian, staring at the floor as she absent-mindedly twisted a strand of hair around her finger. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with red from lack of sleep. The weight of everything that had happened pressed heavily on her shoulders, but there was a spark in her expression. Something fierce, something that hadn't been there before. "Brian," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, something that suggested she had made up her mind about something important. "We can't keep running forever." Brian looked up from where he had been staring out the window, his gaze distant, his mind still replaying the events of the previous night. The footsteps of the mysterious SUV echoed in his memory, the sound of the door slamming shut, the cold, indifferent shadows that had followed them. It felt as though every corner was being watched, every move they made tracked by someone who knew far more than they did. "You're right," he replied softly, his voice heavy with the burden of realization. "We can't outrun this. Not anymore." The revelation had been creeping up on them for days now, but only now did the full weight of their situation settle in. They had no allies, no sanctuary, no safe place to hide. Detective Wallace was a threat they could understand, but the black SUV, it had been a signal, a warning that they were in deeper than they had ever imagined. Megan's expression hardened. "I think it's time we confront him." Brian's heart skipped a beat. "Wallace? No." She shook her head, her voice resolute. "The one behind everything. Whoever is pulling the strings, Brian. It's not just Wallace. There's someone else, someone more dangerous." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The detective was just a puppet, a tool in a much larger game, and whoever was pulling the strings had been manipulating them from the start. But who? Before he could speak, Megan was already standing, pacing back and forth. "I've been thinking about this all night, about the look in Wallace's eyes when we left, the way he acted when we were questioned. He was too calm, too controlled." Brian's mind raced, turning over every interaction with the detective, every suspicious glance, every quiet moment when Wallace had seemed almost too eager to be of help. "You think Wallace is involved in something bigger? What if he's just trying to cover his own tracks?" Megan stopped pacing and looked directly at him. "No, Brian, I think he's scared. I think he's being threatened. I think he's afraid of whoever this is, whoever is really behind all of this." Brian's gut twisted. He had always known that there was more to this than met the eye, but the idea that Wallace might be a pawn in something far darker than they could comprehend shook him to his core. "We need to confront him," Megan repeated, her voice firm. "Get him to talk. If he knows anything, he's not going to keep it hidden forever, and if we can't trust him, we'll find someone else who can help." Brian nodded, though a part of him felt like they were stepping into a trap, but there was no other choice. If they wanted to find out the truth, if they wanted to uncover the identity of the person behind the black SUV, they would have to get answers from Wallace. They couldn't let fear dictate their next move. Hours later, they found themselves outside the police station, the place that had once felt like a sanctuary, now the last place Brian wanted to be. He glanced at Megan, her face set in determination, and then at the station's heavy doors, as if they were the gates to a war zone. "This is it?" Megan whispered, her voice a mixture of fear and resolve. "I know," Brian said, his throat dry. "We just need to be careful. If Wallace knows we're coming, if he's really in deep with whoever's behind this, things could get ugly fast." Megan reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "We'll be careful, but we can't wait any longer. The longer we hide, the more we lose control of the situation." Brian didn't have the heart to argue. He knew that Megan was right. They had spent days running, hiding, and hoping for an answer to fall into their laps. But the time for running was over. They needed to know the truth, even if it meant facing the one person they had once trusted. Inside the station, they made their way through the sterile hallways, the cold fluorescent lights casting shadows on the walls as they passed by offices and desks. They didn't speak, their footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. Brian could feel the tension in the air, the weight of every step bringing them closer to the inevitable confrontation. They found Detective Wallace in his office, staring down at a pile of paperwork, his posture rigid, as though he were trying to avoid acknowledging them. Brian felt his stomach twist, but he pushed it aside. This was the moment. This was the time to confront everything. "Wallace," Megan's voice broke through the tension, cutting through the air like a knife. The detective's head snapped up, his face pale, eyes wide with surprise. "Miss Thomas, Mr. Hughes, what are you doing here?" His voice was shaky, a clear sign that he wasn't prepared for their visit. "We need to talk," Brian said, his voice steady, but his heart pounding in his chest. "We need answers, now." Wallace's eyes flickered nervously. He glanced around the room as though seeking an escape, but there was no way out now. They had him cornered. "What do you think you know?" Wallace asked, his voice low, defensive. Brian took a step forward, his pulse quickening. "We know you're not the one behind all this. Someone else is pulling the strings and you're too afraid to tell us. You've been lying to us from the start." Wallace swallowed hard. I don't know what you're talking about." "You do." Megan stepped in, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "We know you've been protecting someone, Wallace. Someone dangerous." For a moment, Wallace said nothing. His eyes darted around the room, his hand gripping the edge of his desk tightly. It was clear that he was on the verge of a breakdown, but he was still holding back. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Brian felt the walls closing in. "Then tell us, Wallace. Who are we dealing with?" For a long moment, Wallace didn't speak. The silence hung heavy in the room, as if it were holding its breath. Then finally, he opened his mouth. "They'll kill you if you keep digging," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're everywhere, watching, waiting." The words hung in the air, chilling them to the bone. The detective wasn't just hiding something. He was terrified. And whoever he was protecting, whoever was behind this, was far more dangerous than Brian and Megan had ever imagined. Brian's mind spun with what Wallace had just revealed. "They'll kill you if you keep digging." The words echoed in his head, making it hard to breathe. He turned to Megan, whose face was pale but determined. Her lips were pressed into a thin line, and her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She was thinking the same thing. They were not just dealing with a corrupt detective anymore. They were up against something much larger, something that had a hand in every part of their lives for longer than they could comprehend. Brian tried to steady his breathing, focusing on Wallace, who was now looking at the floor, almost as if he were ashamed of what he had said. The detective's hands trembled as he adjusted his glasses, as if the action could somehow shield him from the guilt that weighed on his conscience. "Who are they, Wallace?" Megan asked, her voice low but insistent. "You have to tell us. We can't keep running from shadows. We need answers now." Wallace hesitated, looking between the two of them, his eyes full of fear and regret. For a moment, Brian saw the man he had once trusted, the man who had seemed like a good cop, who had always been there when things went wrong. But now, all that trust was slipping away, thread by thread. I can't," Wallace finally whispered, shaking his head. "I won't be the one to lead you into this. You don't understand what you're up against." "You're already in this with us," Brian snapped, frustration mounting in his chest. "We're already in it. You know more than you're saying." Wallace's gaze flickered to the door, as if he were considering making a run for it. But the look in Brian's eyes told him that there was no escape. He was cornered, trapped by his own lies. "I've been trying to protect you," Wallace said in a voice that trembled. "I didn't want you to get involved. It's too dangerous. You don't know the things I've seen, the people I've had to deal with. They're everywhere, watching you, watching all of us." Megan's brow furrowed in confusion. "But why? Who are they?" "They call themselves the Collective," Wallace said, the words slipping out like a curse. "It's an underground network, a shadow organization that operates under the radar. They have their hands in everything: politics, business, law enforcement. They've been pulling the strings for decades, manipulating events, people, entire lives." Brian could feel the blood drain from his face. "What do they want?" "They want control," Wallace said with a bitter laugh, his eyes hardening as if he were remembering a terrible truth. "They don't care about anything else. They don't care about right or wrong. All they care about is power, and anyone who gets in their way, anyone who learns too much, becomes expendable." The words hit Brian like a ton of bricks. Expendable. He thought of the people they had known over the years, the ones who had disappeared, the cases that had gone cold, the lives that had been ruined by forces beyond their understanding. It was all connected. Everything had been part of the larger plan all along. "Wallace," Megan said, her voice urgent. "How do we stop them? How do we fight back?" Wallace ran a hand through his hair, his face contorted with regret. "You can't. You have to. Walk away now. They won't let you survive if you keep digging. I tried to protect you, but I failed." He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening in sudden realization. Brian followed his gaze and saw what Wallace had seen: a figure standing in the doorway, framed by the dim light of the hallway. The door had been left slightly ajar, and the stranger standing there seemed almost too still. The figure was tall, dressed in black, with an expression hidden behind the shadows. Brian's heart skipped a beat. "Megan," Brian whispered, his voice low and tense. "Get out of here. Now." But Megan didn't move. She was staring at the figure, her body stiff, her hand hovering near her purse, ready for anything. The air in the room had thickened, charged with a heavy electric tension. The figure in the doorway didn't make a move, but Brian could feel the weight of their presence in the room, as if they were waiting for something to unfold. "Who are you?" Wallace's voice cracked, breaking the silence. "How did you find us?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, they stepped into the room slowly, their movements deliberate and controlled. As they drew closer, Brian could see the glint of something sharp in their hand. A knife, polished and gleaming. A shiver ran down Brian's spine. He didn't know who this person was, but he knew that they weren't here for a friendly conversation. The stranger stopped in front of Wallace, their face still concealed. For a moment, there was an eerie silence. Then, without warning, the figure raised the knife and pointed it directly at Wallace's throat. "Your time is up," the stranger said, their voice low and threatening. "You've betrayed the Collective, detective, and now you'll pay the price." Brian's breath caught in his throat. Megan's eyes were wide with fear, but she didn't hesitate. She pulled her gun from her purse, aiming it directly at the stranger's chest. "Get away from him," she commanded, her voice steady but edged with panic. "Drop the weapon now." The figure didn't flinch. Instead, they tilted their heads slightly as if amused. "You're not in control here, Miss Thomas. You never were. You should have stayed out of this. But now..." They paused, their lips curling into something that almost resembled a smirk. "Now you're a part of it." Wallace's face drained of color as the stranger's cold gaze shifted to him. "You failed them," the figure said quietly. "You failed everyone. You should have walked away when you had the chance." Brian stepped forward, his heart racing, trying to make sense of the situation. "Who are you?" he demanded again. "What do you want with us?" The figure's gaze never wavered from Wallace, but their lips parted, and their words hit Brian like a sledgehammer. "I'm the one who owns your future." The room seemed to go still, every second dragging on longer than the last, until Megan's voice broke the silence. "What does that mean?" she asked, her gun still trained on the stranger. A sinister smile played at the corners of the figure's lips. "It means," they said slowly, "that you're too far gone. You're in this for good now, and there's no way out." The stranger's eyes flickered to Brian, then to Megan, and for the first time, Brian felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The silence that followed the figure's chilling words was deafening. It hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Brian's heart raced and his mind spun, trying to process what had just been said. "You're in this for good now." It was as though a heavy weight had settled in his chest, making it hard to breathe. Megan, still holding her gun with a steady hand, didn't flinch, but Brian could see the uncertainty in her eyes. The same uncertainty that he felt creeping into his own soul. They were not in control anymore. They were at the mercy of someone or something that they couldn't even comprehend. The figure in front of them didn't make a move. For a moment it seemed like the entire world had stopped. There was no sound, no movement, just a quiet standoff. Megan's gun remained aimed at the stranger's chest, but her hands were beginning to shake. Brian's grip on his own thoughts tightened. He couldn't let fear take over now. "What do you want from us?" Brian finally managed, his voice strained, but firm. The stranger's lips curled into an almost imperceptible smile, as if they found Brian's question amusing. But there was something else in their eyes, something dark and implacable. "You've already given us what we need," they replied, their voice cold, their tone carrying an authority that sent a shiver down Brian's spine. "You don't get to ask questions anymore. You're already a part of the bigger picture." Brian's mind raced, trying to piece things together. The collective, the shadow organization. It had been pulling the strings in the background, manipulating lives, for decades. But who were these people? What did they want from him and Megan? "You don't get to decide what we're a part of," Megan said sharply, her eyes narrowing as she took a step forward. "We're not your pawns." For the first time, the stranger's gaze flickered, the briefest sign of amusement crossing their face. "Pawns?" they echoed almost mockingly. "No, you're far more valuable than that." Megan's breath hitched, her eyes narrowing as she took another step. "What do you mean by that?" The stranger took a slow, deliberate step toward Wallace, still frozen in place, the knife now pressing against his throat. "We've been watching all of you," the figure said, their voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You've been marked, all of you. Everything you've done, every move you've made has brought you closer to this moment." Brian's stomach churned with unease. He didn't know if it was the gravity of the situation or the sheer dread of what was coming next, but the fear was starting to seep in. Marked? What did that mean? And why were they dragging Wallace into this? What role did he play in all of this? "You're going to watch him die," the stranger continued, their voice flat. "You're going to witness it and then you'll understand. Everything is connected. You think you can fight back, but you've already lost. This was never about you. It was always about him." Wallace's eyes went wide with terror, his breathing shallow as the figure pressed the knife harder against his skin. He was paralyzed with fear, but Brian could see the pleading look in his eyes. He wanted out. He wanted to go back, to forget everything, to make things right. But there was no going back now. Brian's chest tightened with helplessness. He glanced at Megan, who was still holding her gun, but her eyes were frantic, scanning the room for an opening, for a way to save them. "Don't do it," Megan said, her voice steady, but with a hint of desperation. "We're not afraid of you." The figure's expression remained impassive. "It's not about fear, it's about fate, it's about power." You think you can escape it, but you can't. The game's already been set and you're just following the script. Megan's eyes flashed with a sudden realization. Wallace, she whispered, as if a piece of the puzzle had just fallen into place. You knew, didn't you? You've been a part of this from the beginning. You weren't trying to protect us. Wallace's eyes welled with tears. I never wanted this, Megan, he choked out. You don't know what it's like. They own everything. Everyone. They have control over everything. I thought I could help, thought I could find a way out, but what? Brian interrupted, his voice rising. What have you been hiding, Wallace? The stranger didn't allow him to finish. With a swift motion, they jerked the knife away from Wallace's neck and stepped back, their face unreadable. You've said enough, the stranger said coldly. You're both going to witness the consequences of his choices. Megan's hand tightened around the grip of her gun, but she didn't fire. She didn't move. There was no point. They were out of options. They were facing an enemy with an entire network behind them, a force far stronger than any of them had anticipated. Wallace dropped to his knees, his face a mask of shame and terror. Please, he pleaded. I never wanted any of this. I thought I could control it. I thought I could stop them. Brian's stomach twisted as he looked down at the man he had once trusted, his old friend, now broken and undone by his own choices. The stranger moved toward the door, and with a final glance back at the three of them, they spoke one last time. This is just the beginning, they said, their voice as cold as ice. You'll see. We control everything. Every move, every step, there's no escaping us now. And with that, they vanished into the darkness, leaving the room heavy with the sound of Wallace's ragged breaths and the ominous weight of their words. Brian looked at Megan, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what to do next. Brian stood in the darkened room, the air thick with the weight of their situation. The silence after the stranger's departure was suffocating, broken only by Wallace's sobs and the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. The reality of what had just happened hung heavy in the air. He could barely process the severity of it all. Megan didn't speak. She was still holding her gun, the barrel trembling slightly in her grip. Her knuckles were white, the only sign of how deeply rattled she was by the conversation that had unfolded. The truth, however distorted it was, had finally cracked through the surface. Wallace had been involved in something far darker than they could have imagined, and now they were all entangled in it. We need to leave, Megan finally said, her voice steady, but laced with an undeniable urgency. She turned toward the door, eyes scanning the room, as if she expected someone to burst through at any moment. We can't stay here. It's too dangerous. Brian nodded, but something gnawed at him. He couldn't just walk away. Not without understanding what had really happened to Wallace, to all of them. His mind raced. What exactly was he involved in? How much of this did he know? There was so much to uncover, and Brian couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something far more perilous than they could handle. You can't run forever, Wallace muttered from where he knelt on the floor, his voice hoarse. His face was pale, and his eyes were hollow, haunted. The once confident and composed man was now a shell, consumed by guilt. It's already too late. Brian turned to him, his patience thinning. What the hell are you talking about, Wallace? Megan moved closer to him, trying to steady his hand. Let him explain. If he knows something, anything, we need to hear it. Wallace swallowed hard, his eyes not meeting theirs. You think I didn't try to stop it? I didn't want this for any of you, I just… His voice trailed off, as though the weight of his own words suffocated him. You have no idea what they can do. I've seen it firsthand. I've seen them manipulate everything. People, situations, lives. He choked on his breath. I thought I could get out, but they never let you go. You try to walk away and they pull you back in. Brian stepped forward, urgency creeping into his voice. Who are they, Wallace? Who's pulling the strings? Why did they target us? Wallace's lips trembled as if the words were too painful to say. His face twisted in regret, his hands shaking. He glanced up, briefly meeting Brian's eyes. I don't know how much more I can say, but the collective, they have their hands in everything, and the only reason you're involved now is because of what you know about me. You were never supposed to find out. Brian's heart skipped a beat. The collective, he repeated, his voice low. What is that? What do they want with us? They want control, Wallace muttered. They always have. And now that you've seen us, now that you've learned too much, there's no going back. Megan's eyes narrowed. This isn't some organization pulling strings in the shadows, Wallace. These people, what do they want with us? The walls seemed to close in on them. It was as if the air itself had thickened, and Brian could feel the weight of something far larger than they could comprehend pushing down on them. The collective. The name itself felt like a sentence, a prison with no escape. Wallace was struggling to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was tight with fear, and his body was trembling in the wake of everything he had tried to hide. We don't have time for this, Megan said, voice sharp. She grabbed Wallace by the arm, pulling him to his feet. We need answers now. The broken man winced at her touch, but allowed her to pull him up. You don't get it, Megan, he whispered, shaking his head. There's no escaping. The more you know, the more you're a part of this. They've been watching us for years. Watching me. They've always been a step ahead. You're already marked. It's only a matter of time before they find us. They know where we are. They know everything. Brian's mind raced. The terror in Wallace's eyes was no act. He had seen it, felt it. This wasn't just paranoia. This was real. A loud thud at the door snapped them back to reality. Megan's eyes widened in alarm. They're here. Brian felt his pulse quicken. His mind went into overdrive. There was no more time for questions. They had to leave. Now. He pulled Megan toward the window, his body moving instinctively. Go, we need to get out of here, fast. Wallace, who had frozen in place, looked around as if his world had just unraveled. It's too late, he whispered. They're everywhere, they know everything, you can't hide. But Brian wasn't listening anymore. He grabbed Megan's arm and dragged her toward the fire escape. The building felt as if it was closing in on them, as if it were a trap that had finally sprung shut. They didn't have time for answers, only survival. The creak of a door opening behind them sent a rush of adrenaline through Brian's veins. He glanced back for a split second, just in time to see the shadows move through the hall toward them. They were coming. They had to run. Megan's breath was shallow, her pulse pounding in her ears as they bolted down the fire escape. Behind them, the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, the walls closing in as if the building itself were trying to swallow them whole. Brian didn't look back. There was no time. The rain lashed against the windows as Brian and Megan scrambled through the narrow alley, their breath coming in quick, ragged gasps. The fire escape had led them into an unknown street, one that twisted and turned like the labyrinth of secrets they were now caught in. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat, every distant noise sending a ripple of panic through their bodies. Behind them, Wallace's voice echoed in the distance, a constant reminder of the gravity of their situation. You can't outrun them. He had yelled from the window before they descended, his words filled with fear and warning. They're everywhere, there's no escape. Brian didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was focused on one thing only, getting Megan to safety. Whatever Wallace had revealed, whatever it was that the collective was capable of, it didn't matter. Not now. They were at a breaking point, and the only option left was to keep moving. Megan's hand was tight in his, but even with their escape plan in motion, she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes darted to every passing figure, every street corner, searching for any sign of pursuit. The fear in her gaze mirrored his own, but she masked it with a determination he hadn't seen before. We need to find somewhere to hide, Megan said, her voice low but urgent. Somewhere they won't think to look. Brian nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His mind was spinning with the fragments of what Wallace had said. The collective, an organization that had infiltrated every aspect of life, controlling events, manipulating people like pawns on a chessboard. It sounded impossible, surreal, But he had seen enough to know it was real, and now they were part of it. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut. What if they've been watching us for years? He had to get answers, but every answer only led to more questions. How deep does this go? They reached the end of the alley and paused, listening. For a moment, everything was still. The rain had softened, the city's hum barely audible in the distance. It was the calm before the storm. Where, now? Megan asked, breaking the silence. Brian scanned the street ahead. They were in an unfamiliar part of town, grimy, desolate, a place that seemed abandoned. He had no idea where they were or how to escape, but he couldn't let panic take over. Not now. "We'll head for the old warehouse district," he said, his voice more confident than he felt. "It's the one place they won't expect." Megan gave him a skeptical look but didn't argue. She trusted him. She had to. As they started down the street, a flash of movement caught Brian's eye, a figure standing motionless at the far end of the block. Brian's heart skipped a beat. There was something unnerving about the way the figure stood. Its posture stiff, unmoving as if it were waiting for them. "Do you see that?" Megan whispered, her grip tightening on his hand. "I do," he answered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. It just watched them, as if it were a sentinel waiting for them to make the next move. Brian's instincts screamed for him to run. He tugged Megan in the opposite direction, but as they turned, another figure appeared, blocking their path. Then, another and another, silently converging on them from all sides. His blood ran cold. They were surrounded. "Megan, we need to fight," Brian shouted, his mind racing. He didn't have a plan, but he couldn't let them capture them. Not now, not after everything. But Megan didn't respond. Her eyes were wide, her face pale with fear as she looked at the figures closing in around them. One of them stepped forward, tall, broad-shouldered with cold, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through the night. A man in a black suit, his face obscured by a mask. "The collective isn't finished with you," the man said, his voice a low, chilling whisper. Brian felt a surge of anger, of helplessness. He didn't want to go down without a fight. But in that moment, the reality of their situation hit him. The collective wasn't some vague organization, it was everywhere. They were everywhere. "We have to go," Megan said, her voice trembling as she tugged at his arm. But Brian wasn't listening. He couldn't. He wasn't going to give up without understanding what was happening. The only way out was to confront the truth. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice rising. "What do you want with us?" The man in the mask took a step, closer, his voice unwavering. "You already know too much, there is no turning back." As the words hit Brian like a physical blow, another figure stepped into view, a familiar face, someone he hadn't expected to see. Wallace. Wallace. Megan gasped. "What the hell are you doing here?" Wallace's eyes were hollow, the same hollow look from before, but there was something else there now. A twisted, knowing smile. "You were always meant to be part of this," he said, his voice almost empty of emotion. "You're not just running from them, you're running from yourselves," Brian's mind reeled. Wallace wasn't just another victim. He was part of the collective. He was part of this web they had walked into. The truth that had eluded them for so long was now crashing down on them all at once. "No," Brian whispered, taking a step back. "This can't be real. You've been lying to us this whole time." Wallace's smile grew colder, more detached. "You still don't get it, do you? They've been watching us for years. The moment you uncovered what I've been hiding, you became part of it. It was always going to end like this." Brian felt his world shift beneath his feet. There was no escaping this. There was no way out. The figure in the mask raised a hand, and with a swift movement, darkness seemed to fall over them, blotting out everything. When Brian regained consciousness, it wasn't the bright lights of safety he saw, but a dim, cold room that smelled of stale air and something darker. His head throbbed, his vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he had died. The shock of what had happened last, Wallace's betrayal, the figures surrounding them, The cold darkness hit him in waves, each memory more painful than the last. But as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he realized that he wasn't alone. Megan was sitting in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees, her face pale and drawn. She looked up when she heard him stir, her eyes filled with fear and confusion. "Brian, you're awake," she whispered, relief flooding her voice. But it was quickly replaced by something darker. I don't know what's happening. We were captured. They took us." Brian sat up with effort, his body still aching. "The collective," he muttered, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. "They've been controlling everything." Megan nodded slowly. "Wallace, I don't understand. He was one of them all along, wasn't he? That's why he kept lying, twisting everything. He knew." The weight of her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, oppressive and thick. Wallace wasn't just an accomplice. He was part of the very system they'd been running from, the web that had ensnared them before they even realized what was happening. Brian clenched his fists in frustration. "He never cared about us," he spat, though the realization wasn't a new one. He had known deep down that Wallace's smiles and assurances had been empty, but hearing the truth now felt like a gut punch. He stood up slowly, wincing at the ache in his joints, and walked toward the barred window. There was no light outside, just an endless black void stretching out beyond the iron bars. Where were they? The question gnawed at him. How deep was this conspiracy? "Do you think they'll kill us?" Megan asked softly, breaking the silence. Brian turned to her, his heart aching for her vulnerability. She had never asked to be dragged into this mess, but now they were both trapped in it, bound together by their search for truth and escape. "I don't know," he admitted, "but whatever happens, we fight." Megan met his gaze, her eyes filled with silent understanding. They both knew that there was no going back. Even if they escaped this place, the collective's reach was everywhere, and it would be impossible to outrun it for long. A cold, unfamiliar voice broke through their silence. "You won't escape." The voice was calm, collected, yet there was an unmistakable malice behind it. Brian and Megan turned in unison to see. The man from earlier, the one with the mask, standing in the doorway. His figure was shrouded in shadow, his expression unreadable. "The collective always wins," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "You were never meant to survive. Once you uncovered the truth, you sealed your fate." Brian's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? What truth?" The masked figure stepped forward, the click of his shoes echoing through the room. He was impossibly calm, as if he had no fear, no doubt in what he was saying. "The truth is that the world you know is a lie. The collective has been shaping reality for decades. Every choice, every major event has been manipulated. And now, you're part of the game." Megan took a step back, her voice trembling. "That's impossible. How can that be true?" The figure tilted his head slightly. "You already know. You've seen the signs. You felt the pull. It's in the air, in every conversation, every decision. You were chosen, Brian. You and Megan. You were always meant to be here to learn what you have learned." Brian's mind was spinning. He couldn't breathe. It was like the walls were closing in around him. "You mean to tell me none of this is real? We've been puppets this whole time?" The man nodded slowly. "Exactly. You and your little rebellion against Wallace? All part of the script. There was never any hope of escape, only the illusion of choice." Brian felt the world slipping away from him. How much of his life had been fabricated? How much of his suffering, his struggles, had been set in motion by unseen hands? A cold, bitter laugh escaped his lips. "Then why are you still here? Why not just end it?" "Because," the figure said, stepping closer, "there is still one thing you must understand." His voice dropped to a whisper, as if revealing some terrible secret. "You were never meant to uncover this, but you did, and now you're a liability." Brian's heart skipped a beat. "A liability?" he repeated, his voice thick with disbelief. "Yes, and the truth is, it's too late for you. You can't escape the game." The masked figure raised his hand, and in that moment Brian realized that their fate had already been sealed. Before he could react, a sharp, searing pain shot through his side. He gasped, clutching his abdomen as the world around him blurred. His legs buckled beneath him. "Megan," he whispered, his voice barely audible as the room spun. Through his foggy vision, he saw Megan's terrified face, heard her frantic cries, but everything felt like it was slipping away. Everything fades to black. When Brian awoke again, it was to the sound of familiar voices, voices filled with warmth and love. The pain was gone, replaced with an overwhelming sense of relief. His head cleared, and he realized in the depth of his soul that it was over. They had won. And as he opened his eyes, the last vestiges of his nightmare disappeared into nothingness. The storm had passed, the threat had been neutralized, and the truth, however painful, had been exposed. In that final moment, he realized that the greatest victory wasn't just survival, but the knowledge that the world could be rebuilt, that people could fight for truth, for justice, and they would never be silenced again.